I never planned to stay in the cabin for long. I just needed a quiet place to clear my head, to get away from the noise of the city. My uncle had left it to me in his will, a small one-room structure deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road. I never knew him well, but when I saw the place for the first time, I understood why he had chosen to live out here alone. It was peaceful. No traffic, no neighbors, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of some unseen animal. It was the middle of January when I arrived. Snow covered the ground in thick layers, and the only way in was by snowmobile. I had packed enough supplies to last 2 weeks: canned food, bottled water, extra fuel, batteries, and a thick sleeping bag. The cabin itself was simple. One main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a cot pushed against the wall. There was a shed out back where my uncle had kept tools, along with a small supply of firewood. The first few days were quiet. I spent my time reading, chopping wood, and exploring the area around the cabin. The snow made everything feel still, like the whole world had been put on pause. At night, the temperature dropped fast. I kept the wood stove burning, listening to the crackling of the fire as I lay in my sleeping bag. But on the 5th night, things changed. I had just finished eating a can of chili and was sitting by the fire when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, a deep, hollow sound moving through the trees. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A heavy crunching sound. Footsteps in the snow. I set my spoon down and reached for the flashlight. The cabin had no windows, just a thick wooden door with a small peephole. I moved to it slowly, my breath fogging up the wood as I pressed my eye against the hole. Darkness. Nothing but the shadows of trees, their branches shifting slightly in the wind. I waited, listening. The footsteps had stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a moose passing through. I shook off the feeling and went back to the cot, but I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning I found the tracks. They were human, not boot prints, bare feet. The snow had softened the edges, but I could see the shape of toes, the curve of an arch. They led from the tree line to the cabin, stopping just a few feet from the door. Whoever it was, they had stood there for a long time before walking back into the woods. I felt a chill run through me. No one lived out here. The nearest town was over 40 miles away. If someone was walking around barefoot in the snow, they wouldn't last long. I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. But the woods were empty. I spent the rest of the day uneasy. I checked my supplies, made sure the door was locked, and kept the shotgun close. I had brought it more as a precaution against bears, but now it felt like a necessary comfort. That night, I kept the fire going and tried to stay awake, but at some point, I must have drifted off. Then the sound came again. This time it was closer, a slow, deliberate crunching in the snow. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. The shotgun was already in my lap. I moved to the peephole, my hands sweating despite the cold. A shape stood outside. A man, tall, thin, naked. His skin was pale, almost blending in with the snow. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the door. I swallowed hard. My breath felt trapped in my throat. Then he took a step forward. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a log from the fire and jammed it against the peephole, blocking the view. My hands were shaking. I backed away slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps came closer. Then they stopped. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The fire crackled. The wind howled against the walls. I didn't dare look outside. When the sun came up, I finally forced myself to check. He was gone, but the footprints remained. This time, they led around the cabin, circling it again and again. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things, fueled up the snowmobile, and left as fast as I could. The whole way back, I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing at the tree line, watching. I never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up to the sound of footsteps outside my window, and I wonder if he ever really stopped following me. This is just the start of a longer version. Let me know if you want an extended version, and I'll add more details, build up, and tension. I don't know why I thought it was a good idea to go out there alone. Maybe I wanted the quiet. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. But I shouldn't have done it. It started as just another hike, something I'd done 100 times before. I had planned a 2-day solo trip deep into the mountains, far from the usual trails, carrying only what I needed to get through the night. The forecast was good, my pack was light, and I felt confident. I had my map, my GPS, and enough food and water to last me through the trip. The first few hours were perfect. The sun was out but not too hot, and the air was cool in the shade of the trees. The trail was rough but manageable, winding through thick pines, with patches of exposed rock and loose dirt. I walked steadily, feeling good about the pace I was making. I had planned my route carefully, making sure to stick to paths that, while not heavily traveled, were still well documented. By mid-afternoon, I had made it further than I expected. I stopped to eat a granola bar and drink some water, checking my GPS against the map. Everything lined up. I took a moment to appreciate the silence. No cars, no voices, no sounds except for the occasional bird and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then I made a mistake. I saw what looked like a shortcut on my map, a small, unmarked trail branching off from the main path. It seemed to cut straight through the valley, shaving a good hour or two off my route. It looked fine on the map, and I figured it was probably an old logging road or a forgotten hiking path. So I took it. At first, it was easy enough to follow. It was narrower than the main trail but still visible, winding downhill into a dense patch of trees. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The wind died down, and even the birds seemed to disappear. But I didn't think much of it. I was making good time, and I was sure I'd be back on the main trail before sunset. Then the trail started to fade. What had been a clear path turned into a mess of underbrush, loose dirt, and scattered rocks. I hesitated, checking my GPS again. The signal flickered, struggling to keep up with the tree cover. I waited for it to correct itself, but it just spun, searching for a connection. I should have turned back, but I didn't. Instead, I kept going, thinking I could reconnect with the trail if I just pushed a little further. The ground was uneven, sloping downward at a steep angle, covered in fallen leaves and rotting wood. My boots slipped a few times, but I caught myself, grabbing onto trees as I went. Then the ground gave out. I didn't fall far, maybe 6 or 7 feet, but I landed hard. My right ankle twisted under me, sending a sharp, blinding pain up my leg. I yelled out instinctively, but the sound was swallowed by the trees. I sat there for a few minutes, breathing through the pain, trying to assess the damage. My ankle hurt, but I could still move it. Probably just a bad sprain. But the real problem was my position. I had fallen into some kind of gully, surrounded by steep, muddy slopes. The way I had come down was too slippery to climb back up. I tried my GPS again. Still no signal. Panic started creeping in, but I pushed it down. I had supplies. I had a map. I just needed to get my bearings and find a way out. I scanned my surroundings, looking for an easier way up. The gully stretched ahead, curving out of sight. I figured if I followed it, I'd eventually find a spot where I could climb out. So I started walking. Every step sent pain through my ankle, but I gritted my teeth and kept moving. The gully twisted and turned, the walls growing steeper on either side. The ground was damp, covered in slick mud and patches of moss. Tree roots jutted out from the banks, some big enough to grab onto, but none sturdy enough to climb. I checked my watch. almost 5 p.m. The light was starting to fade. That's when I found the first sign that something was wrong. A boot print, not mine. It was half buried in the mud, the edges softened by moisture, but it was fresh. Someone else had been here. Recently. For a second, relief washed over me. Maybe there was another hiker out here. Maybe I wasn't alone. But then I looked closer. The print was deep, heavier on one side, like whoever made it was carrying something or limping, and it wasn't going in the direction I was heading. It was coming from deeper in the gully. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I kept moving, slower now, listening to every sound. The forest was still eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then I saw the second footprint, and the third, and then something worse. Piece of fabric, caught on a low branch, fluttering slightly in the breeze. Faded, torn, stained. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. It was probably nothing, just a lost hiker who had come through before me. But something about it felt wrong. I kept going, moving carefully, scanning the ground ahead. Then I found the backpack. It was half buried in the mud, the zippers open, one strap torn. I hesitated before crouching down, ignoring the sharp pain in my ankle. I brushed away the dirt and pulled it free. It was old, but not too old. The material was still intact, though waterlogged. I unzipped the main compartment. Empty. I checked the side pockets. Also empty. No ID, no food wrappers, no sign of who it had belonged to. Just a backpack, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. Something was very, very wrong. I stood up slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. I needed to get out of here. Now, I kept moving, forcing myself forward despite the pain in my ankle. The gully was getting deeper, the air colder. The walls were starting to close in, the trees overhead blocking out the last of the daylight. Then I smelled it, a sharp, rancid stench cutting through the damp air. Rot. My stomach turned. I didn't want to see what was ahead, but I had no choice. I rounded the bend and stopped. There, tangled in the underbrush, was a body, or what was left of one. The clothes were shredded, the skin dark and bloated. The hands were gone. The face was barely recognizable. Animals had been at it. I staggered back, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't an accident. Someone had left this person here, and I was not alone. I turned and ran. Pain shot through my ankle, but I didn't care. I pushed forward, scrambling up the side of the gully, grabbing at roots, clawing at the dirt. I could hear something behind me. Footsteps, fast and heavy, closing in. I didn't look back. I reached the top and threw myself over the edge, landing hard. I got to my feet and limped forward, heart hammering. I had to find the main trail, had to get out. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A sliver of light through the trees. The trail. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my lungs. I burst onto the path and didn't stop. I ran until my legs gave out, until I couldn't breathe, until I was sure, absolutely sure, I wasn't being followed. I never found out who that body belonged to, or who had left it there, and I never ever took a shortcut again. I had always been the kind of person who liked to be alone in the woods. Something about being out there, far from everything, made me feel more alive than anything else ever could. It wasn't about proving anything. I wasn't trying to test myself or survive against the odds. I just liked the quiet, the sense of being separate from the rest of the world, where no one could reach me unless I wanted them to. That's why, when I planned a solo hiking trip deep into a national forest, I didn't think twice about it. It was something I had done plenty of times before. I had experience, the right gear, and enough knowledge to handle whatever came my way. I didn't know this would be the time everything went wrong. The plan was simple. 3 days out in a remote section of the mountains, following an old trail that had mostly been forgotten. It wasn't technically abandoned, just rarely used. One of those places you had to know about to find. I had mapped my route carefully, marking water sources and good spots to set up camp. I left early in the morning, my pack loaded with everything I needed. The first few miles were easy, the trail wide and well-maintained. But as I got deeper into the forest, the path grew narrower, the trees thicker. The sounds of the highway faded until all I could hear were my own footsteps, the rustling of the wind, and the occasional call of a bird. It was exactly what I wanted. By noon, I had made good progress. The sky was overcast, but the air was warm, and I felt strong. I stopped by a small creek to fill my water bottle, taking a moment to rest. The water was clear and cold, flowing lazily over smooth stones. I knelt down, scooping some up with my hands, letting it run through my fingers. That's when I noticed something strange. On the opposite bank, partially hidden by a fallen tree, was a pile of bones. At first, I thought they were animal bones, maybe a deer or a small bear. But as I looked closer, something about them felt off. They were scattered haphazardly, some half buried in the dirt, others resting on the surface. The skull was missing, and several of the larger bones had deep grooves in them, like they had been cut or gnawed on. I stood up slowly, my heartbeat quickening. It wasn't unusual to find remains in the woods. Predators dragged kills to secluded spots. Sometimes animals died of natural causes. But this didn't look right. It looked disturbed, moved. I told myself it didn't matter. I refilled my water, adjusted my pack, and kept moving. The trail grew rougher as the day went on. The trees pressed in closer, the underbrush thick and tangled. My GPS flickered a few times, struggling with the dense cover. I wasn't worried. I had my map, my compass. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I had marked for camp, a small clearing near a ridge, overlooking the valley below. The view was incredible, rolling hills, dense forests stretching for miles. No signs of people, no distant campfires or parked cars. Just wilderness. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and sat back, listening to the woods around me. The air was cool, the wind gentle. Then I noticed something. The woods were too quiet. I hadn't heard a bird in hours. No insects buzzing, no rustling in the underbrush. Just silence. I told myself it was nothing. Some days the forest was like that. Still, something about it made my skin crawl. I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I lay there, listening, my breath slow and steady. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Not the random rustling of an animal. Not the wind shifting the branches. Something moving. Someone moving. The steps were slow, careful. Close. My mouth went dry. I reached for the knife in my pack, gripping the handle tightly. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, my ears straining. But I heard nothing else. Eventually, exhaustion won. My grip on the knife loosened, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. When I woke, the sun was rising, the sky a dull gray. I climbed out of my tent, stretching, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. That's when I saw them. Footprints, leading from the treeline, circling my tent. I stared, my stomach twisting into knots. The prints were deep, the edges still crisp from the night's moisture. Someone had been here, watching me. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I needed to leave. Now, I moved quickly, almost jogging down the trail. Every few minutes, I checked over my shoulder, scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement. I saw nothing, but I felt something. By noon, I was deep into the woods, far from where I had camped. My legs ached, my back was sore, but I didn't stop. I wanted to put as much distance between me and that campsite as possible. Then I smelled it. Something foul. Rotting. I slowed, covering my nose with my sleeve. The smell was coming from up ahead, just off the trail. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to keep moving, but something in me, curiosity, maybe stupidity, made me step forward. Through the trees I saw it. A cabin. It was old, barely more than a shack, with a sagging roof and walls darkened by weather and time. The door was slightly open, swaying gently in the breeze. The smell was worse here. Thick, cloying. Something dead was inside. I turned to leave. Then I heard it. A rustling. Behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. The woods were still, but I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. I started walking. Fast. Then running. The forest blurred around me, branches slashing at my arms, my boots slipping on loose dirt. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out. When I finally looked up, I was back on a real trail, a marked trail. I had made it back. I didn't stop. I kept moving until I reached my car, threw my pack inside, and drove until the forest was nothing but a fading blur in my rearview mirror. I never reported what I found. The bones, the footprints, the cabin, because deep down, I knew no one would believe me, and I knew without a doubt that whoever had been out there that night was still there. I never liked camping alone. There was something about being deep in the woods, miles away from anyone, that made me uneasy. But I had been doing solo camping trips for years, trying to push myself past the fear. And for the most part, I had gotten used to it. This trip was supposed to be easy. 3 nights in the backcountry, deep in a national forest that stretched for miles in every direction. No designated campsites, no trails, just thick, untouched woods. I had planned the route carefully, picked a good spot near a small stream, and packed enough supplies to last me the entire time. The drive out took half the day. I parked my truck at the edge of an old logging road, the last place any vehicle could reach. After that, it was just me and the trees. The hike was tough. The forest was thick, the undergrowth making it hard to move in some places. I had to check my map every half hour to make sure I was still on course. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant sounds of cars or people. Just the wind moving through the pines and the occasional rustle of small animals in the brush. By the time I reached the spot I had marked on the map, the sun was getting low. It was perfect. A flat clearing, soft ground covered in pine needles, a small stream nearby. I dropped my pack, stretched out my sore shoulders, and got to work setting up camp. The first night was uneventful. I built a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat for a while, listening to the quiet. The air was cool, the smell of pine thick. I should have felt at peace, but I didn't. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't anything obvious. The forest just felt too still, like it was holding its breath. I ignored it, chalking it up to my usual nerves. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and forced myself to sleep. At some point in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it, movement outside the tent. Not an animal. Something heavy, slow, careful. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps circled the tent, crunching softly over the pine needles. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to stay still. The footsteps stopped. Then nothing. I lay awake for hours, waiting, listening, but I never heard it again. By morning, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a deer, curious about the smell of food. I shook off the fear, made breakfast, and spent the day exploring the area. The second night, I stayed up later, keeping the fire going longer than before. The woods were silent, too silent. I barely slept. And then on the third night, it got worse. I woke up again. The fire had burned down to embers. The air was cold, still, and something was outside my tent. Closer this time. I could hear breathing. Slow, deep breaths, just on the other side of the thin fabric. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Something pressed against the tent. A hand, not a paw, not a branch. A hand. It stayed there for a long time. Then, just as slowly, it pulled away. The footsteps moved back into the trees. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whistle, low, drawn out, like someone calling a dog. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, waiting, heart hammering in my chest. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and left. The hike back felt different. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. The feeling never went away. Even when I reached my truck, even when I drove away, I felt it. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. There's a reason people tell you to stick to marked trails. I used to think that was just something they said to keep tourists from getting lost. I had spent years hiking alone, cutting through backcountry, bushwhacking through thick forests, scrambling over ridges where no clear trail existed. I was careful, experienced, and always prepared. I knew how to read a map, how to use a compass, how to find my way back if things went wrong. But none of that mattered in the end. This happened 2 years ago, and I still wake up some nights, sweating, hearing the sound of dry branches snapping behind me. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day trip. A loop through a remote section of national forest, miles away from any towns or roads. I had found the route online, an old logging trail that connected to a high ridge with incredible views. Not many people hiked it anymore, which made it perfect for me. I liked being alone in the woods. It was the only place that ever felt right. I packed everything I needed: food, water, first aid kit, knife, GPS, map. The forecast was clear. No storms, no high winds. I started early, parking my truck at the trailhead before the sun was fully up. The first few miles were easy, winding through thick pines, the ground soft with fallen needles. The air was cool, crisp. Birds called out in the distance, the rhythmic sound of woodpeckers echoing through the trees. I felt good, strong. By noon, I had covered a lot of ground. The trail was overgrown in places, but still easy to follow. It climbed gradually, leading toward the ridge. I took my time, stopping to filter water from a clear, cold creek. I ate a quick meal, checked my map. Everything was going exactly as planned. But then, a few miles later, I saw something strange. A shoe, half buried in the dirt, just off the trail. It was old, torn, the laces missing. The kind of thing you'd expect to see in a thrift store bin, not lying in the middle of the woods. I frowned, nudging it with my boot. It didn't make sense. This wasn't a popular area. The last trip report I had read was over a year old. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. I tried to ignore it, kept moving. An hour later, I found something worse. A backpack, faded, ripped open down one side, half hidden beneath a fallen branch. It had been there a long time. The fabric was stiff, stained with dirt. I crouched down, my stomach tightening. There was no ID inside. No wallet, no phone. Just a few rusted zippers, a torn piece of fabric where a logo used to be. I stood up quickly, wiping my hands on my pants. My pulse was pounding now. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe some hunter had abandoned it. Maybe a hiker had lost it years ago. But I didn't believe that. I kept moving faster now. My skin felt tight, like something was pressing in on me. The trees thinned as I climbed higher, the air growing cooler. The trail was barely visible now, more of an impression in the grass than a real path. But I had my compass, my map. I wasn't worried about getting lost. Then I saw the footprints. Fresh, not mine. They cut through the grass, leading up the ridge. Deep, clear, not distorted by wind or rain. Someone had been here. Recently. My hands felt cold despite the sun. I looked around, scanning the trees, the rocks, the spaces between them. Nothing moved. But I knew. I wasn't alone. I kept walking, forcing myself to stay calm. I told myself it was just another hiker, someone I hadn't seen. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The sun was getting lower now, dipping toward the horizon. I needed to find a place to set up camp. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. The ridge was too steep to climb in the dark. I found a flat patch of ground near a cluster of boulders. It was sheltered from the wind, a good spot. I set up my tent quickly, my movements stiff, uneasy. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I ate a protein bar, drank some water, listened to the forest around me. The wind whispered through the trees, dry branches shifting, creaking. But no birds, no insects, nothing. I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening. At some point, I drifted off. Then a sound. Soft, slow, footsteps. I snapped awake, my body rigid. The footsteps were close, circling my tent. Not an animal, not the random rustling of the wind. Someone was out there. I gripped my knife, my breath shallow. The steps stopped. Silence. I waited. Minutes. Hours. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I must have slept, because when I opened my eyes again, the sky was pale gray, the first light of dawn stretching over the ridge. I sat up, my muscles stiff, my throat dry. Then I saw it, just outside my tent. A single footprint, closer than before. I packed my gear in minutes, shoving everything into my pack without caring how. I started moving, fast. The ridge was steep, the path narrow, winding between sharp rocks. My legs burned, my breath came hard, but I didn't stop. I needed to get out. I followed the trail down, moving as quickly as I could without slipping. Every few minutes I checked behind me. Nothing, but the feeling was still there. That pressure, that weight, like eyes on my back. The trail flattened out near the base of the ridge, leading into a dense stand of trees. The last stretch before the road. I moved faster, then movement. Up ahead, a shape, a figure, standing half hidden in the trees, still as stone. I stopped. My heart slammed against my ribs. Then it moved, not toward me, not away, just shifted slightly. Watching, I didn't think. I just ran. Branches whipped at my face, my boots slipping on loose dirt. I ran until my chest ached, until my vision blurred. I burst out of the trees onto the gravel road where my truck was parked. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I didn't look back. I started the engine, peeled out, the tires skidding on loose gravel. I drove for miles before I could breathe again. I never told anyone what happened. I never went back. I still hike, but never alone, never off trail, because some places aren't meant to be explored. And some things, once they find you, they don't let go. I always hiked alone. It wasn't some deep philosophical thing. I just liked the quiet. No distractions, no need to keep pace with anyone else, no talking. Just the sound of my boots on dirt and the steady rhythm of my breath. I had done plenty of hikes before, some longer, some rougher, but this one was different. I had planned it for weeks. A remote trail deep in the national forest, one that few people used. No marked campsites, no rangers, no signs. Just miles of woods, untouched. That was the appeal. I parked my truck at the trailhead, A small dirt pull-off at the end of a long gravel road. No other cars. I should have felt relieved by that, but instead, I felt something else. I shook it off. I checked my gear, hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, and stepped onto the trail. The first few miles were easy. A well-worn dirt path, the scent of pine thick in the air, the sun filtering through the trees in patches of gold. The quiet was absolute. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the wind in the branches and the occasional rustle of something small in the underbrush. As I went deeper, the trail grew narrower. The trees closed in, the canopy thick overhead. The sunlight dimmed, the air cooled. Felt different here. Not bad, just heavier. Like the forest was pressing in around me. I pushed forward. By late afternoon, my legs were burning, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. I found a small clearing by a stream and decided to set up camp. I dropped my pack, stretched out my sore muscles, and went through the routine. Tent up, sleeping bag unrolled, small fire built. I boiled water for a dehydrated meal and sat by the creek, listening to the water rush over the rocks. That's when I noticed it. The woods had gone silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. I hadn't realized it before, but now it stood out like a hole in the world. I scanned the trees, my skin prickling. Nothing moved. I told myself I was being stupid. The forest was full of sounds, but sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes everything went still for no reason at all. I finished eating, put out the fire, and crawled into my tent. I left the rain fly off so I could see the stars through the mesh. The sky was clear, the air crisp, perfect. Eventually, I fell asleep. I woke up to a sound, a branch snapping. Close. My eyes snapped open. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Then, another sound. Rustling. Slow, deliberate. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the trees outside my tent. Nothing. Just shadows and branches. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe. I was in their territory, after all. Still, I kept the flashlight in my hand as I lay back down. My heart was still hammering, but eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted off. The next morning, I packed up quickly. That uneasy feeling from the night before still clung to me, but I shook it off. I hiked deeper into the woods. The trail was rougher now, barely visible in some places. I had to check my map constantly, making sure I was still on course. That's when I saw it. A footprint. Not mine. A single boot print pressed deep into the dirt. Fresh. Someone else was out here. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. It was possible another hiker had passed through earlier that morning, but I hadn't seen any signs of people.
No fairs, no campsites.
And I hadn't heard anyone. I moved on, but now I was hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the trees. Then, a few miles later, I found something else. A piece of fabric caught on a low branch, dark-colored, like from a jacket. It looked recent. I swallowed hard. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I needed to set up camp. I didn't want to stop, but hiking in the dark was a bad idea. I found a small clearing and went through the routine again. Tent up, fire built, food heated. I ate quickly, scanning the trees as I chewed. The woods were silent again. I felt like I was being watched. I forced myself to lie down, but I didn't sleep. Not really. I just lay there listening. Then, sometime in the night, I heard it again. A branch breaking, closer this time. My pulse slammed against my ribs. Then breathing, slow, steady, right outside my tent. I gripped my knife, my fingers slick with sweat. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then silence. I didn't move. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. The moment the sun rose, I packed up and started moving. Fast. I needed to get back to my truck. The trail twisted and turned, and I forced myself to focus, to keep my pace steady. Then I saw something up ahead. A tent. Not mine. It was half collapsed, the fabric torn. Gear was scattered around, like someone had left in a hurry. I hesitated, then stepped closer.
Bootprints.
Deep in the dirt. A lot of them. I peered inside the tent. Empty, except for one thing. A backpack. Identical to mine. Same brand. Same color. Same model. My stomach turned to ice. I stepped back, heart pounding. Then movement. In the trees. Something shifting just out of sight. I didn't wait. I turned and started walking. Fast. Then running. I ran until my lungs burned, my legs screaming in protest. Then finally I saw it. The road. The parking lot. My truck. I sprinted the last stretch, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped my keys. The engine roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, tires kicking up gravel, then tore down the road. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never found out who was out there, or how long they had been following me. But I know one thing. I wasn't alone. I've always hiked alone. I don't do it for the thrill or to prove something to myself. I do it because I love the quiet, the way the world disappears when I'm deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road. Out there, it's just me, my pack, and the land. Nothing else. No distractions, no noise, no people. That's why I chose this trail. It wasn't an official one, just an old game path cutting through a stretch of national forest. I had found it on a map, a forgotten route winding through thick pines, across ridgelines, and down into deep valleys where few people ever went. A full week alone, covering nearly 70 miles before looping back to my truck. That was the plan. It was late September. The days were still warm, but the nights had started to get cold. Perfect hiking weather. I had checked the forecast. Clear skies, no rain, no sudden temperature drops. I packed light but smart. Enough food for 7 days, a good sleeping bag, a GPS, a map, and a compass as backup. I started early, leaving my truck parked off an old logging road. There were no other cars around. No signs that anyone had been here recently. That was a good sign. The first day was easy. The trail was rough in some places, overgrown in others, but it was manageable. The forest was quiet except for the usual sounds. Birds calling, leaves rustling, the occasional crack of a branch as something moved in the undergrowth. I made good time, covering nearly 15 miles before setting up camp near a stream. That night, the first thing felt off. I was used to the sounds of the woods, the way the trees creaked, the distant hoot of an owl, the scurrying of small animals in the brush. But that night, something was different. It was too quiet. No wind.
No insects.
Just silence. The kind that made the hair on my arms stand up. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the temperature drop had kept the animals still. Maybe I was overthinking it. I went to sleep. I woke up suddenly. Something had snapped a branch outside my tent. Not a small twig, a thick, heavy branch. I lay there, my hand gripping the knife I kept beside my sleeping bag. I listened. Nothing. Then footsteps. Slow, careful, circling my tent. My pulse pounded in my ears. A bear? Maybe? No, bears don't move like that. I stayed still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I didn't sleep again. At first light, I unzipped my tent, stepping out slowly, my knife in my hand. Nothing.
No prints.
No signs of anything. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up fast and moved out. The second day was harder. The trail climbed steeply, winding up a ridge. My legs burned. My breath came hard, but I pushed forward. Then I saw it. A tree, stripped of its bark in long, uneven strips. Not claw marks, cuts. Deep, deliberate cuts. The wood beneath was pale and fresh. It hadn't been done long ago. I swallowed, my mouth dry. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing at the top of the ridge. From here, I could see for miles. Rolling hills covered in dense forest. No roads, no houses, just wilderness. But something caught my eye. Far down the valley, barely visible through the trees. Smoke. Thin, curling up into the sky. A campfire. Someone else was out here. I hadn't seen another person since I left my truck. No tire tracks, no footprints, no signs of human activity. But someone was there. I tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. This was public land. People camped here. It wasn't strange. I hiked down the other side of the ridge, moving fast, wanting to put distance between me and whoever had made that fire. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I ate a cold meal, crawled into my sleeping bag, and lay awake, listening. The silence was worse this time. Hours passed. Then movement. Far off at first. Then closer. Not an animal. Not a random rustling in the brush. This was footsteps. Deliberate. Slow. I gripped my knife. The steps stopped just beyond my camp. Minutes passed. Then faint breathing. I couldn't see anything. But someone was there. Standing in the dark. Watching. I didn't move. Didn't make a sound. Eventually, the breathing stopped. The footsteps faded. I lay there, wide-eyed, heart pounding, until the first hint of dawn touched the sky. Then I packed my gear and got the hell out. I was off trail now, cutting through dense forest, heading toward the closest logging road. I just wanted to leave. Then I saw the footprints. Not mine. Deep, clear prints in the damp earth, leading the same direction I was going. Whoever it was, they were ahead of me. I stopped, my pulse hammering. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing, but the feeling was there. I wasn't alone. I moved fast. By midday, I reached an old fire road. Grass had grown over most of it, but it was still passable. If I followed it east, I would eventually hit the main road where my truck was parked. I took a deep breath, forced myself to keep moving. The road twisted through the trees, winding down into a shallow ravine. That's where I saw it. A cabin. Not a normal one. It was old, half-collapsed, the roof sagging, the walls warped with age, and the door wide open. I stopped, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. But something caught my eye. Near the entrance, a pile of bones. Small ones. Animal, probably, but stripped clean. Arranged in a pattern. A spiral. I turned and ran. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed against a tree. Gasping for breath, I listened. Nothing. But I knew. I wasn't alone. I forced myself up, forced myself to keep going. Hours passed. Then, finally, a break in the trees. The road. My truck. I stumbled toward it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys out. I didn't look back. I started the engine, floored it, and didn't stop until I hit pavement. I never went back. I don't hike alone anymore, because now I know, somewhere out there, deep in the woods, someone's watching, and they never left. I have always been careful. I plan my hikes meticulously, every route, every backup plan, every piece of gear packed for worst-case scenarios. I don't take unnecessary risks. I don't push past my limits. That's why, in over 10 years of solo hiking, I've never had a close call. Never had a reason to feel real fear out there. Until my last hike. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day loop in the mountains, cutting through remote backcountry where few people ever went. The kind of place I loved. Untouched, silent, miles away from civilization. I had studied the map for weeks. The trail was old, unmaintained, a forgotten logging road that faded into game paths and dense wilderness. It was perfect. I packed light but smart. My tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a full water bladder, and a filter for refilling in the streams. My GPS, my map, my compass. My knife. I always carried my knife. I left my truck at the trailhead early in the morning. The dirt road leading there was rough, barely passable, and there were no other vehicles in sight. That didn't surprise me. This wasn't a place people came often. The first few miles were easy. The old logging road was wide, the footing solid. The trees were dense, towering pines stretching high into the sky, their trunks thick and rough with age. The air was cool, crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine needles filling my lungs. I felt good. By midday, the road had narrowed into something wilder, overgrown with thick brush, the ground uneven with roots and fallen branches. I had to slow my pace, picking my way through carefully. That's when I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. A tree, stripped of its bark in long, jagged strips. Not claw marks, not weather damage. These were cuts, deep, deliberate, carved with a blade. I frowned, stepping closer. The exposed wood was pale and fresh, untouched by rot or time. It hadn't been done long ago. I looked around. Nothing. Just the trees, the thick undergrowth, the silence of the deep woods. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old hunter marking his way, maybe just some bored camper with a knife. Still, unease settled in my stomach. I kept moving. The trail became harder to follow, twisting through thick brush, the ground uneven and littered with fallen logs. My progress slowed. Then I found the second tree. Be another carving. This time a shape, a spiral etched deep into the wood. My breath caught. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, the thick undergrowth beyond the trail. Nothing, but I felt it, that heavy, pressing stillness, the kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. I kept walking, faster now. The sun dipped low, shadows stretching long across the forest floor. I needed to find a place to camp. I found a small clearing near a creek. It wasn't ideal, too open, too exposed, but I didn't have a choice. The terrain ahead was rough, and I didn't want to be stumbling through it in the dark. I set up my tent quickly, my movements tense, controlled. I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I forced myself to eat, my stomach tight with unease. Then I crawled into my sleeping bag, my knife close, listening. The forest was silent, too silent. No insects, no rustling leaves, just that heavy, suffocating stillness. Then, sometime deep in the night, a sound. Soft, slow, footsteps. Not an animal, not random movement in the brush. Someone walking. I held my breath, my body rigid. The steps stopped just beyond my camp. Silence, then faint breathing. I stayed still, gripping my knife, my heart hammering in my chest. Minutes passed. The breathing stopped. The steps retreated. I didn't sleep. The first light, I packed up fast and started moving. I didn't follow the trail. I cut through the trees, bushwhacking my way east, toward the logging road that would take me back to my truck. I moved fast, ignoring the burn in my legs, the ache in my shoulders. I just wanted to get out. Then I found the cabin. It wasn't marked on my map. It was old, half-collapsed, the roof sagging, the walls warped with age, and the door wide open. I stopped, my breath shallow, my pulse thudding in my ears. Something was inside. Not someone. Something. Bones. Small ones. Animal, maybe, arranged in a pattern on the floor. A spiral. I turned and ran. I ran until my legs screamed, until my lungs burned, until my body begged me to stop. I didn't stop. Not when the trail disappeared beneath me, not when branches whipped at my face, Not when my pack caught on thick brambles, yanking me back like grasping hands. I ran until I saw the break in the trees. The road. My truck. I stumbled toward it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys out. I didn't look back. I started the engine, floored it, and didn't stop until I hit pavement. I never reported it. Who would I even tell? I don't hike alone anymore, because now I know out there in the deep woods beyond the trails and the maps, someone is watching, and they never left. I've been hiking alone for years. It's not about testing myself or proving anything. It's just how I like it. Out in the woods, miles away from everything. It's quiet. No distractions, no people, just me and the land. I plan every trip carefully, bring the right gear, and make sure I know my route before I set foot on the trail. I don't take chances. That's what made this trip different. It wasn't a last-minute plan, but it wasn't my usual kind of hike either. I had a full week off work and wanted to try something more remote than my usual spots. I spent weeks looking at maps, checking old forestry records, tracing faded trails that had long been abandoned. That's how I found it. A forgotten stretch of wilderness, deep in a national forest, far from any towns or roads. There was an old fire road leading to the trailhead, but from there, it was all unmaintained paths. Overgrown switchbacks cutting through deep valleys, skirting along ridgelines, disappearing into thick forest. I mapped out a 70-mile loop that would take me deep into the backcountry, across untouched land where few people ever went. It was perfect. I packed light but smart. Enough food for a week, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag rated for the cold nights, a water filter, a map, a compass, and my GPS as backup. My knife, as always. I set out early, leaving my truck parked at the end of the fire road. The dirt lot was empty, no other cars. That was a good sign. I wanted to be alone out here. The first day went as planned. The trail was rough, but I expected that. Fallen trees blocked parts of the path. Thick brush had swallowed others. I moved slowly, checking my map often, making sure I was still on course. The forest was dense, old-growth pines towering overhead, the scent of damp earth heavy in the air. By late afternoon, I had covered about 15 miles. I set up camp near a creek, ate a quick meal, and crawled into my sleeping bag. That night, something felt off. I couldn't explain it. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No wind, no insects, just a heavy stillness that pressed in around me. I tried to ignore it. I had been in the woods long enough to know that sometimes it just felt different. I forced myself to sleep. I woke up suddenly. Something had moved outside my tent. Not a small animal. Something heavy. I lay there, gripping my knife, listening. Nothing. Then, faintly, a slow, steady breathing. Not mine. I didn't move. Didn't make a sound. The breathing stopped. I listened for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. I stepped outside my tent, scanning the area. Nothing was disturbed. No tracks, no signs of anything. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was the wind, or just my mind playing tricks on me. I packed up and moved on. The second day was harder. The trail climbed steeply, winding up a ridge. My legs burned. My shoulders ached from the weight of my pack, but I kept going. Then I saw it. A tree, stripped of its bark in long, uneven strips. Not claw marks, cuts. Deep, deliberate cuts. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. But I felt it, that creeping unease, that sense that I wasn't alone. I kept moving, faster now. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing at the top of the ridge. From here, I could see for miles. Rolling hills covered in dense forest, no roads, no houses, just wilderness. Then I saw the smoke. far in the valley, thin and curling up into the sky. A campfire. Someone else was out here. I hadn't seen any signs of people since I started. No footprints, no tire tracks, no old campsites. But there it was. A fire. I felt that unease again, stronger this time. I turned away, heading down the other side of the ridge, wanting to put distance between me and whoever was out there. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I ate cold food, lay in my tent, and listened. The forest was silent again. Then, sometime past midnight, a sound. Soft, slow, footsteps. Not an animal. Not random movement in the brush. Someone walking. I gripped my knife. The steps stopped just beyond my camp. Silence. Then faint breathing. I stayed still, heart pounding. Minutes passed. The breathing stopped. The steps retreated. I didn't sleep. The first light, I packed up and left. I didn't follow the trail. I cut through the trees, moving fast, heading for the closest road. Then I found the footprints. Not mine. Deep prints in the damp earth, leading in the same direction I was going. Whoever it was, they were ahead of me. I stopped, scanning the trees. Nothing. But I knew. I wasn't alone. I moved faster. By midday, I reached an old fire road. Grass had grown over most of it, but it was still passable. If I followed it east, I would reach my truck. I took a deep breath, forcing myself forward. The road twisted through the trees, dipping into a shallow ravine. That's where I saw it. A cabin. Old, half collapsed, the door hanging open. And just beyond it, a pile of bones. Small ones, stripped clean, arranged in a spiral. I turned and ran. I ran until my legs gave out, until my chest burned, until I couldn't breathe. I ran until I saw the break in the trees. The road. My truck. I stumbled toward it, shaking so badly I could barely get the keys out. I didn't look back. I started the engine, floored it, and didn't stop until I was miles away. I never reported it. I don't hike alone anymore, because now I know, somewhere out there, deep in the woods, someone's watching, and they never left.